Emily liked to think of her marriage as a canvas, polished, painted in warm tones, and displayed proudly for the world to admire. From the outside, she and David were the kind of couple neighbors envied. A charming house on a quiet street, dinner, parties that hummed with laughter, and holiday cards that looked like they were pulled from glossy magazines. But behind the framed smiles and carefully chosen words, there was a silence that lingered too long. It started subtly. David would come home later than usual, his shirt wrinkled and his excuses thinner than the air between them. "Late meeting," he'd mutter, loosening his tie before retreating to the shower. Emily never pressed, not at first. After all, she was raised to believe that love meant trust, and trust meant patience. Still, she noticed, the way he avoided her eyes when she asked how his day had gone. The dinners he skipped, leaving her to push food around her plate while candlelight flickered against empty chairs. Even the weekends, once filled with morning walks and shared coffee, had dwindled into silence. At night, lying in their king-sized bed, Emily would reach for him, only to find his back turned, his breathing steady and distant. Sometimes he claimed exhaustion, other times a headache. But what hurt most was the unspoken wall he was building, brick by brick, silence by silence. One evening she stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing wine glasses from a dinner she had eaten alone. She caught her reflection in the window. A woman, in her 30s, hair tied neatly, smile carefully rehearsed for anyone watching. But the reflection's eyes betrayed her, hollow, searching, afraid. "What am I missing?" she thought, drying her hands. When friends asked, she laughed it off. "Oh, David's been swamped with work," she'd say, brushing aside their concerned glances. It was easier to tell lies than admit she was starting to doubt the truth of her marriage. She tried to fill the gaps. She redecorated the living room, bought new curtains, even planned a weekend getaway. David nodded politely at her suggestions but never followed through. Work always came first, or so he claimed. One Saturday she waited for him with dinner set and wine chilled. 8 o'clock came. 9. By 10, the pasta had hardened, and the candles burned low. When the door finally opened, David stumbled in with the smell of whiskey clinging to his clothes. His eyes were glazed, his tie loosened. "You didn't call," she said softly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the storm building inside her. "Lost track of time," he replied, brushing past her to collapse on the couch. Emily stood, frozen, watching him drift into sleep as if the hours she had spent waiting meant nothing. She wanted to scream, to shake him awake and demand answers. Instead, she gathered the plates, her movements deliberate and controlled, the way she'd been trained to manage emotions in a world that rarely listened to women's rage. Later, alone, in bed, Emily stared at the ceiling. The air felt heavy with secrets she couldn't name. She thought about the first years of their marriage, the way David used to hold her, whispering dreams of a future together. Somewhere along the way, those whispers had turned to silence, and the silence had begun to choke her. Yet Emily clung to the lie. It was easier than admitting the truth. Something was breaking, and she couldn't fix it alone. Outside, the night hummed with crickets, ordinary and calm. But Emily knew, deep down, that ordinary was slipping away. A fracture had formed, and cracks spread silently beneath the surface of her perfect life. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would find out where David truly went when he said he was. Working late. The next morning, Emily moved through the house like a ghost, her mind still circling the vow she had made the night before. She would find out where David went, what he was hiding. But life has a way of disguising truths in the ordinary. The clatter of dishes, the hum of the coffee maker, David's quiet footsteps descending the stairs. Everything seemed so normal it was almost unbearable. "Morning," he muttered, eyes glued to his phone as he slid into a chair. Emily poured his coffee, her gaze lingering on the glow of his screen. His thumbs moved quickly, a faint smile touching his lips. She hadn't seen him smile like that in weeks. It wasn't for her. Later, when David left for work, Emily felt the silence of the house press in on her. The coffee cup still on the table, the faint trace of his cologne in the air. Ordinary things that now felt sinister. She stared at his phone, forgotten on the counter. Her breath caught. He never left it behind. Her hand trembled as she picked it up, the smooth glass reflecting her anxious face. For a moment, guilt clawed at her chest. She wasn't the type of wife who snooped. But then she remembered the dinners gone cold, the nights alone, the smile he saved for someone else. With shaking fingers, she unlocked the screen. The messages were easy to find. A thread saved under a single letter. See, Emily scrolled slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. The texts were brief, cryptic, fragments of longing that made her throat tighten. Last night was worth every risk. When will I see you again? You make me feel alive. Emily's first thought was what she had always been taught to believe. Another woman, some faceless intruder stealing what was hers. But the tone was different. These weren't the sharp, secretive exchanges of a fling. They were tender, raw, brimming with vulnerability. And then she saw it. The message that made her blood run cold. I can't keep lying to her forever. I want to be with you truly. Her hands trembled so violently she almost dropped the phone. Her. That was her. He was lying to her. But the intimacy in those words, the way they spoke of freedom and truth, it didn't feel like the language of a man chasing lust. It felt like someone stepping into the light after years in the dark. The realization hit like ice water. What if C wasn't a woman at all? She scrolled further, searching for clues. The messages grew more daring, slipping between jokes and declarations. You're the only one who understands me. Wish I could hold you tonight. Counting the hours until I see you again, love. Her chest tightened. The pet names, the tenderness. This was a relationship, not an affair. And the possibility she had never allowed herself to consider now loomed before her. David was hiding not just a lover, but a truth about himself. Emily dropped the phone onto the counter as if it had burned her. Her legs felt weak. She pressed her palms against the cool surface, trying to steady her breath. The room seemed to tilt, shadows lengthening as her thoughts spiraled. Betrayal had always been her greatest fear, but this was something deeper. An erasure of the life she thought she knew, the man she thought she married. When David came home that night, he kissed her cheek absent-mindedly, unaware that she now carried a secret of her own. She knew, and she would not rest until she uncovered the full truth. The knowledge gnawed at Emily for days. Every time David's phone buzzed, every time he excused himself with that familiar line, working late, her chest tightened with a fury that threatened to swallow her whole. She had the proof in her hands. Now, but proof wasn't enough. She needed to see. She needed to watch the lie unfold with her own eyes. On Thursday evenings, she followed him. It wasn't planned. She had no blueprint for betrayal, no experience in shadowing a man she thought she knew. She simply noticed him slipping on his jacket earlier than usual. His tone clipped when he told her not to wait up. Something inside her snapped. She grabbed her keys, waited a few minutes, then pulled out of the driveway, headlights off until she was sure he wouldn't notice. The streets blurred past in streaks of sodium light. Emily's pulse quickened as she kept her distance, hands gripping the wheel tight. David's car wove through town until it pulled into a small, dimly lit bar off a side street, a place Emily had never seen before. The sign flickered, casting red shadows against the wet pavement. She parked half a block away and sat trembling, watching as David stepped out. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't hurried. He looked lighter, freer, as if he'd left the weight of their home behind. And then she saw him. A man stood waiting near the entrance, hands shoved in his pockets, posture relaxed. He was tall, dark-haired, with a smile that seemed to light up the night despite the failing neon. David's face transformed at the sight of him. The tension that had been etched into his features for months melted away in an instant. They embraced. Not a casual handshake or friendly pat. A true embrace, lingering, intimate, unashamed. Emily's breath caught in her throat, a strangled sound that fogged the inside of her car window. Her worst fear crystallized into a single undeniable moment. This was C. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her hands clutched the steering wheel as if it could anchor her to the world that was slipping away. She had imagined another woman, but never this. Never the possibility that her husband's heart belonged to a man. Through the glass, she watched them step inside together. The sight seared into her like fire, each detail cutting deeper. The easy laughter, the way David leaned in close, the glow in his eyes. She had not seen that glow directed at her in years. Emily sat there for what felt like hours, her body frozen in a mix of grief and rage. Her mind screamed questions. How long? Who else knew? Was she ever truly loved, or only a mask for the man beside her? The betrayal was twofold. Not only a lover hidden in shadows, but a truth about David himself that had been kept from her, perhaps from everyone. Finally, when her breathing steadied, a cold clarity took hold. Tears blurred her vision, but behind them something harder began to form. If David had chosen lies over honesty, then she would choose discovery over denial. She started the car, pulling away from the curb with trembling hands. She didn't need to see more tonight. She had seen enough. The image of David in another man's arms would haunt her long after she left the street behind. Back at home, Emily sat in the darkened living room, the clock ticking loudly in the silence. She stared at the door, waiting for David to return, wondering what excuse he would invent this time. And when he did, she promised herself, she would no longer be the naive wife nodding along to rehearsed lies. For now, though, she remained silent, her rage simmering beneath the sorrow. Because soon, very soon, David would be confronted not just by her questions, but by the storm she was preparing to unleash. The night after Emily saw David with Chris, she prepared dinner with meticulous care. The table was set with her grandmother's china, a candle flickering in the center. To anyone else, it might have looked like a romantic gesture, a wife rekindling intimacy with her husband. But beneath the glow of the candlelight, Emily's hands trembled. Tonight would not be about love. Tonight she would strip away the lies. David arrived late, as usual. His jacket was draped over his shoulder, his hair slightly tousled, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He offered her a distracted smile before slipping into his chair. "You cooked," he said, sounding almost surprised. Emily poured him wine, her own glass untouched. She watched the liquid swirl, dark and heavy, before meeting his eyes. "Yes, I thought we could actually sit down together for once." For a moment they ate in silence. The clink of silverware was deafening. Emily's heart pounded. She rehearsed the words in her mind over and over, until finally they spilled. "Out. I know about Chris." The fork froze halfway to David's lips. His face drained of color, then hardened into a mask of practiced calm. He set the utensil down slowly, his gaze flicking to the candle, then back to her. "What are you talking about?" he asked, voice steady, but too careful. "Don't," Emily snapped, her voice trembling between fury and heartbreak. "Don't. You dare lie to me. I saw you, I followed you, I know." The silence stretched. Finally, David leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply as if conceding a battle he'd fought too long. "So," he muttered, "you found out." Emily's throat tightened. "How long? How long have you been lying to me, sneaking out, making me feel like I was the problem?" David rubbed his temples, his tone almost weary. "Emily, it's not what you think. Not what I think." Her laugh was hollow. "I saw you with him. I read your messages. You said you couldn't keep lying to me. So tell me, what am I supposed to think?" He looked at her then, his eyes dark with something between shame and defiance. "I never meant to hurt you. I've been living a life that wasn't mine, pretending to be someone I'm not, just to fit into the box people expected. With Chris it feels different, it feels real." The word struck her like a physical blow. She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "So our marriage, our life, what was that, fake, a performance?" David leaned forward, his tone suddenly sharper, cutting through her pain. "No, I loved you, Emily. I still care about you. But you wanted perfection. You wanted the dinners, the house, the smiles for the neighbors. You never wanted to see what was underneath. Her breath hitched. Don't you dare put this on me. His voice lowered, dangerously calm. You never asked, Emily. You never wanted the truth. You wanted the fantasy. And when I couldn't keep up with it, I found someone who saw me for who I am. Gaslight. She could feel it twisting through his words, turning her grief into guilt, her fury into doubt. For a flicker of a moment, she wondered, had she missed the signs? Had she been so desperate to hold on to her perfect life that she'd ignored the cracks? But then she remembered the laughter she saw, the embrace she would never erase from her mind. This wasn't her fault. Emily stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Her voice shook, but her resolve was iron. You don't get to rewrite this, David. You lied. You betrayed me. And now you expect me to carry the blame? No, this isn't on me. For the first time, David looked uncertain. He opened his mouth, then closed it, retreating behind silence. Emily blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. Enjoy your dinner, she whispered, walking away. In the shadows of the hallway, her tears finally fell. But beneath them, anger smoldered, stronger than ever. Because betrayal was no longer just a wound, it was fuel. Emily barely remembered climbing the stairs after blowing out the candle that night. The house felt colder, emptier, as though the walls themselves recoiled from what had been spoken. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying David's words. You wanted perfection. You never wanted the truth. The cruelty of it gnawed at her. He had not only betrayed her, he had twisted the knife by making her doubt herself. By morning, her exhaustion felt like a hangover. Still, she pulled herself together, slipping into the mask she had worn so often before. When her sister called later that day, Emily forced her voice into brightness. Yes, everything's fine. David's just working late again. You know how it is. She laughed, light and easy, as though her world hadn't shattered the night before. But behind closed doors, the facade cracked. Emily drifted through rooms like a stranger, obsessing over details she couldn't control. She caught herself glancing at David's phone whenever he wasn't looking, straining to hear the faint buzz of a message, wondering if it was Chris. On the other end, at night her imagination became her tormentor. She pictured David slipping away after she fell asleep, driving to Chris's apartment, shedding the life he had built with her like a discarded coat. She imagined them together, laughing, touching, sharing the intimacy that had been stolen from her bed. The visions were so vivid they made her chest ache. Sometimes she had to press her hands against her ribs just to remember she was still breathing. She tried to bury the images, but they returned, sharper each time. And with them came something darker. Anger. A poisonous fire that pulsed through her veins until she could taste bitterness on her tongue. Still, Emily kept up appearances. She joined friends for brunch, smiling across the table as they gushed about their husbands' promotions or children's milestones. She nodded, chimed in, even raised a toast. Yet beneath the polished veneer, she thought only of how easily life could fracture, how no one truly knew what happened behind closed doors. Every lie she told tightened the noose of silence around her. She could have confided in someone, her sister, her friend Sarah, but shame sealed her lips. What would they think if they knew the truth? That her husband had chosen a man over her? That she had been blind for years? The humiliation seemed unbearable. So she swallowed it. She smiled. She pretended. But the poison seeped deeper. One evening, as she folded laundry in their bedroom, she caught sight of David's jacket draped across a chair. She reached into the pocket and found a receipt. 2 glasses of wine, a shared dessert, the date stamped just days earlier. She traced her finger over the ink until it smudged. Rage surged through her, violent and raw. She wanted to rip the fabric, to shred every piece of him that touched Chris. Instead, she folded the jacket neatly and placed it back, her hands trembling with restraint, because anger was power, and she was beginning to understand she could wield it. When David came home later that night, Emily greeted him with a smile so convincing it startled even her. She kissed his cheek, asked about his day, and set his dinner before him as if nothing were wrong. But as she watched him eat, her thoughts darkened. Secrets, she realized, were like venom. They didn't vanish when swallowed. They spread, slowly but surely, until they poisoned everything. And Emily was already poisoned. Emily had learned to wear her mask well. To the outside world, she was still the graceful hostess, the devoted wife who spoke warmly of David's career and their picture-perfect life. Inside, though, her chest felt like a cracked vase barely holding together, poison seeping through every fracture. So when Sarah called out of the blue, Emily almost ignored the invitation. An old college friend, Sarah had always been brash and unfiltered. Qualities Emily once admired but now found exhausting. Yet something in Sarah's voice, that mix of nostalgia and insistence, nudged Emily into saying yes. They met at a small cafe downtown, the kind with chipped mugs and warm lighting. Emily walked in rehearsing her smile, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress. Sarah rose to greet her, hair shorter than Emily remembered, her hug firm and grounding. "God, it's been forever," Sarah said, pulling back to study her. "You look the same. Maybe a little tired, though." Emily forced a laugh. Life catches up with all of us. For a while, they reminisced about professors they hated, late-night study sessions, the chaos of youth. It felt almost safe, almost normal, until Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. "So how's David?" Emily stiffened. "He's fine. Busy with work, as always." Sarah tilted her head, eyes sharp. "You know, back in college he was always complicated. Remember that party sophomore year? He disappeared for hours, and when he came back, people whispered. There were rumors, Em, about him and that guy from the swim team." Emily's heart stuttered. "Rumors," she repeated flatly, as though saying the word would dissolve it. Sarah shrugged, sipping her coffee. "I never put much stock in gossip, but looking back, he always seemed like he was hiding something, like he was living two lives." The words lodged deep in Emily's chest. 2 lives. That was exactly what she had seen with her own eyes. The David who smiled for her, for their friends, for the neighborhood, and the David who glowed in Chris's arms. "Maybe people just misunderstood him," Emily said, though her voice sounded far away, even to herself. "Maybe," Sarah agreed, though her expression suggested otherwise. "But you were always the one who made him look normal, like you grounded him. Maybe that's why he married you." Emily's pulse raced. Normal, grounded, a mask, just as she had feared. When they parted, Emily hugged Sarah tighter than expected, clinging to the warmth of familiarity. But as she drove home, Sarah's words circled endlessly in her mind. The affair wasn't sudden. The betrayal wasn't new. It had roots stretching back years, perhaps decades, long before Emily ever walked. Down the aisle. Back at the house, she set her purse down with deliberate care. David wasn't home yet. He rarely was. Emily stood in the living room, the shadows stretching long across the walls. For the first time, she realized her marriage had never been the solid foundation she believed. It had always been built on sand, on secrets, on whispers from the past, and those whispers were growing louder, carrying her closer to a truth she could no longer ignore. The conversation with Sarah lingered like smoke in Emily's lungs. Every word, every insinuation, painted David's betrayal in darker shades. She couldn't let it rest. Not anymore. Knowing wasn't enough. She needed to hear it from the source, from the man who had stolen the life she thought was hers. So Emily devised a plan. She waited until David left for work one morning, then sat at the kitchen table, staring at Chris's name on the text thread. Her fingers hovered above, the screen trembling. She crafted a message with surgical precision, masking her fury with calm curiosity. "This is Emily. I'd like to talk. Just coffee, nothing dramatic. I need clarity. Please." She half expected silence. Instead, Chris replied within minutes. "Don't want to cause trouble, but if you need answers, I'll meet you." They chose a small cafe downtown, the same one she had visited with Sarah. By the time Emily arrived, her stomach churned with equal parts dread and adrenaline. She spotted him instantly, Chris sat by the window, back straight, hands clasped as if he too was bracing for impact. He rose when she approached, his smile tentative but warm. Too warm. "Emily," he said softly, as if speaking her name was an apology. She sat, folding her hands to keep them from shaking. "Thank you for meeting me." Silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Emily broke it first. "I know about you and David. I don't want to scream or fight, I need to understand." Chris hesitated, then nodded. His voice was calm, steady, like someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind. "David loves you, Emily. He does. But he also loves me. He's torn and it's killing him." Emily flinched at the word love. "If he loved me, he wouldn't have lied. He wouldn't be sneaking around behind my back." Chris's gaze softened. "He told me you wouldn't. Understand, that you wanted everything perfect, that you'd never accept the truth about him. He said you'd rather live in denial than see who he really is." The words cut deep, echoing David's accusations from the night of their confrontation. Emily's heart pounded. "So that's what he tells you, that I'm the problem, that I made him hide?" Chris hesitated, then leaned forward. "He promised he'd leave you. He said he just needed time, that you wouldn't take it well, that you'd unravel." Emily's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Unravel, that's convenient." Chris's brow furrowed. "I'm not here to hurt you, Emily. I care about him. And I think deep down, he cares about you too. But he can't keep living two lives. Neither of us can." For a moment, Emily studied him. Chris wasn't cruel. He wasn't smug. He was earnest, vulnerable. And that somehow made the betrayal worse. Because it meant David wasn't just chasing lust. He had built a second life, a second love, and left her to rot in the shadows of it. Emily's throat tightened. "Do you have any idea what this feels like? To realize your marriage was a lie? To picture him with you while I sit alone in that house, waiting for a man who never comes home?" Chris's expression faltered. He opened his mouth, then closed it, words failing him. Emily rose, her chair scraping against the floor. Her pulse thundered in her ears, rage simmering beneath every breath. "He's been lying to both of us, Chris. Don't fool yourself into thinking otherwise." She didn't wait for a reply. She left the cafe with her chest burning, her vision blurred with fury. Back in her car, Emily gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. David had painted her as controlling, unstable, a wife too blind to see. He had given Chris the same script he gave her, manipulating them both to preserve his fragile facade. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was war. The night after meeting, Emily could no longer contain the storm inside her. Every glance at David's empty chair, every echo of silence in the house, poured gasoline onto her fury. By the time the clock struck midnight, her rage was no longer a whisper in her chest. It was a roar. David stumbled in late, reeking faintly of alcohol and perfume that wasn't hers. He tossed his keys carelessly onto the counter, loosening his tie as though he hadn't left her pacing for hours. "You're late again," Emily said, her voice low but sharp. He sighed, not even looking at her. "Don't start, Emily, I'm tired." Her composure cracked. "Tired? I wait here every night cooking meals that go cold while you're off with him. Don't you dare tell me you're tired." David froze, then turned slowly, his eyes narrowed. "So you met him?" The words landed like a slap. "Yes," Emily spat. "I looked into the eyes of the man you've been betraying me with. And do you know what he told me? That you promised to leave me. That I'm just the obstacle keeping you from your real life." For a moment, David's mask slipped. Panic flickered in his gaze, but it quickly hardened into disdain. "Chris doesn't understand, neither do you. You've always needed control, every detail perfect, every smile rehearsed. You suffocated me, Emily." Her throat tightened. "I gave you everything. My trust, my loyalty, my life. And you repay me with lies?" David's voice rose, sharp and cruel. "Don't pretend you're a victim. This marriage was dead long before Chris. You just refused to see it. You wanted the illusion, The words tore through her like glass. Emily's hands trembled, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. Then tell me the truth. Do you want a divorce? David didn't hesitate. Yes. And when I leave, I'll take everything with me. The house, the accounts. You'll have nothing, Emily, nothing. Her knees nearly buckled. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was annihilation. The man who once whispered promises of forever now stood before her, vowing to erase her completely. You can't, she whispered. I can, he said coldly. You're unstable. Everyone will believe me. You've been unraveling for months, and I've kept quiet, but in court, that silence will end. Emily's vision blurred. 1,000 images flashed in her mind. Him laughing with Chris, her waiting alone at the dinner table, Sarah's voice hinting at years of hidden truths. Something inside her snapped, a final thread breaking. You've destroyed me, she whispered. David sneered. No, Emily, you destroyed yourself. The room seemed to tilt. She could hear her pulse pounding, louder than his words. Her grief twisted into something darker, sharper. Not weakness, not despair. Resolve. She turned away before he could see the flicker of intent in her eyes. Go to bed, she said softly. We'll talk tomorrow. David scoffed, muttering under his breath as he disappeared down the hallway. Moments later, the bedroom door slammed shut, leaving Emily alone in the dark. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the knife block gleaming under the dim light. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She wasn't sure yet what she would do, but she knew one thing. She would never let him strip her of everything. Love had rotted into betrayal. Betrayal had hardened into rage. And rage, at last, was becoming something far more dangerous. The storm began at dusk. Thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the windows, while rain lashed against the glass in relentless waves. Emily stood in the kitchen, knife in hand, slicing vegetables with deliberate precision. Every cut was sharp, steady, controlled. Nothing like the chaos raging inside her. The house was heavy with silence. David hadn't returned yet, and she found herself listening for the sound of his car, for the slam of the door, for the careless voice that had once whispered devotion. Her eyes flicked to the small vial resting beside the stove. Its contents, pale and deadly. She hadn't planned it this way, not exactly. But after nights of pacing hallways, after David's threats to leave her penniless, after Chris's revelations, the idea had rooted itself firmly in her mind. And once planted, it grew. Tonight she would no longer be powerless. Tonight she would decide the ending. When David finally arrived, shaking rain from his coat, his face was weary but cold, distant. He barely looked at her. Dinner ready? He asked, loosening his tie. Emily forced a smile. Almost. She ladled soup into bowls, her movements graceful, practiced. No tremor betrayed her. The poison dissolved into the broth as easily as sugar in tea, leaving no trace. She set the bowl in front of him and took her seat across the table. For a while, the only sound was the storm and the quiet clink of spoons. David ate quickly without comment, his gaze drifting to his phone beside his plate. Emily watched. Each swallow he took a drum beat in her chest. When his hand paused, when his breath hitched, her pulse quickened. At first he rubbed his temple, as if fighting off a headache. Then came the cough, low, rough, spreading into his chest. His spoon clattered against the bowl. Emily, his voice cracked. She didn't move. She sat frozen, eyes locked on his face as it drained of color. He clutched his throat, gasping, panic flooding his expression. His chair scraped back violently as he tried to stand, but his legs buckled, sending him crashing to the floor. Help, he rasped, his body convulsing. Emily rose slowly, her expression hardening. She looked down at him, this man who had destroyed her with lies, who had promised to take everything, who had smiled for another while leaving her hollow. Tears prickled her eyes, but she did not bend to help. You took everything from me, she whispered, her voice steady over the thunder. Now it's my turn. David's movements weakened, his breaths shallow. Lightning illuminated the kitchen, casting sharp shadows across his face. For a moment, Emily thought she saw regret in his eyes, or maybe fear. And then, with one final gasp, his body stilled. The storm outside howled, rattling the windows as if nature itself bore witness. Emily stood over him, trembling. Her chest heaved with the weight of what she had done, but beneath the fear was a strange calm. The silence of the house felt different now, final, absolute. And then came the knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm. Emily froze, her blood running cold. Another knock followed, louder this time. She stepped carefully over David's body, her hands slick with sweat. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Chris stood there, drenched from the rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes searched hers, desperate, uncertain. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking through the thunder. "Is David here?" He isn't answering his phone. Her mind spun, panic rising in her throat. Behind her, the kitchen light glowed faintly, illuminating the overturned chair, the untouched bowl of soup, the outline of David's body on the floor. She forced the door only halfway closed, blocking his view. "Now isn't a good time," she stammered, her voice strained. Chris frowned, confusion etched across his face. "Please, I need to talk to him. Just for a minute." Emily's heart pounded so violently, she thought it might break free of her chest. If Chris stepped inside, everything would unravel. The guilt pressed against her ribs, the weight of David's lifeless body just feet away. "Tomorrow," she whispered, gripping the doorframe with white knuckles. "Come back tomorrow." But Chris didn't move. He stood staring at her, eyes narrowing as if sensing the shadows behind her words. And in that moment, Emily knew the night wasn't over. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one she had just unleashed. The storm still battered the house long after Chris left, leaving Emily shaking in the doorway. She shut the door, leaning against it as thunder rumbled above. Her pulse pounded in her ears. David's body lay motionless in the kitchen, his face pale beneath the flickering light. For a long moment she couldn't move. Then survival instinct surged through her, cold and steady. If she didn't act, everything would collapse. Her freedom, her reputation, the life she still clung to. She had to rewrite the scene, turn the truth into a story no one would question. She dragged David's body toward the table, her breath ragged with effort. His limbs felt heavy, unyielding. She positioned him in the chair, arranging his hand around the wine glass, tilting his head to face the table as though he had simply fallen into despair. She smeared fingerprints across the rim, hers layered, atop his to blur the evidence. Then she moved to the cabinet. She pulled down a bottle of whiskey, half empty, and placed it within arm's reach. She sprinkled a handful of David's prescription pills onto the counter, leaving the bottle uncapped beside them. Suicide. The story had to say suicide. Lightning lit the room as Emily wiped the counters, scrubbing away any trace of the vial, any hint of her hand. She checked the stove, the sink, the drawer where she had kept the poison. Gone, clean, invisible. But the silence was shattered by a sound behind her. Emily. Her body froze. She turned slowly, dread knotting her stomach. Chris had come back, rain dripping from his coat, his expression raw and haunted. "I forgot my umbrella," he said softly, though his eyes shifted past her, scanning the kitchen. His gaze lingered on the wine glass, on the pills, on David slumped, in the chair, his face blanched. Oh my God. Chris stumbled forward, kneeling beside David. He shook him gently, panic in every movement. "David! David!" Emily's throat tightened, but she forced herself to step forward. Her voice cracked, in rehearsed despair. I think he's gone." Chris looked up at her, anguish etched across his face. "What happened?" She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "He came home drunk, he was rambling, angry. Then he took the pills, he drank and—" Her voice broke, perfectly timed. "I couldn't stop him." Chris shook his head, tears filling his eyes. "No, he wouldn't do this, he wouldn't." Emily swallowed hard, her mask never slipping. You don't know what he said to me tonight. He was drowning, Chris. He couldn't live the lie anymore. Maybe he thought this was the only way out. Chris covered his face with his hands, sobs muffled against his palms. His grief filled the room like a storm of its own. Emily stood back, watching, her expression carefully composed. Yet beneath the mask, guilt gnawed at her ribs. She hadn't expected Chris to arrive tonight. She hadn't planned on his brokenness being part of this, and yet, perversely, his presence was protection. He could vouch for her. He could confirm the despair, the chaos. But protection came with risk. If Chris ever questioned the scene too closely, if his grief sharpened into suspicion, he could destroy her. The front door rattled with another crash of thunder. Emily glanced toward the window, imagining flashing lights, sirens, the detectives who would soon swarm her home. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, almost tender. "We need to call the police." Chris nodded numbly, still cradling David's lifeless hand. Emily turned away, her face hidden in the shadows. Her heart pounded, her mind racing. The story was in motion now, and she would have to play her role flawlessly. Because the detectives would come, and they would look at her with suspicion in their eyes. The police came quickly, their radios crackling against the hush of the storm's aftermath. Emily stood in her living room wrapped in a blanket, her expression carefully composed between grief and shock. Chris sat hunched on the couch, hands trembling as he repeated the story Emily had whispered into his ear. David had been drinking, had taken pills, had collapsed before either of them could stop it. The detectives nodded, but their eyes lingered too long. They moved through the house with measured steps, scanning, taking photographs, collecting evidence. Their questions came gently at first. Had David been depressed? Any history of mental health struggles? Did he ever mention suicide? Emily answered with the fragility of a grieving wife. He was under pressure. Work, marriage, everything. It weighed on him. I thought he was holding it together, but maybe I was wrong. The detectives exchanged glances she couldn't read. They left that night with the body, but not before assuring her they would need to follow up. Days later, the cracks began to show. One detective returned with a folder of receipts, dinners for two, bars across town, places David had never mentioned. Another brought transcripts of text messages, threads pulled from David's phone that suggested a secret relationship. The name Chris surfaced again and again. Emily feigned ignorance, her mask slipping only when she realized Chris himself had been questioned. He had told the truth, or at least his truth, that David had promised to leave her, that their marriage had been unraveling for months, that Emily was fragile and unpredictable. Her stomach twisted when the detective repeated his words. Chris, her accidental alibi, was also the one painting her as unstable. She saw it in the detective's eyes, the suspicion growing, the narrative shifting. Soon, whispers of foul play reached the courtroom. It became a spectacle, every detail of her marriage dissected under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Emily sat rigid in the defendant's chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, Chris testified with tears in his eyes. He spoke of David's torment, of his longing for freedom, of Emily's controlling presence. Every word felt like a dagger. The prosecutor pressed harder. Mr. Holloway, did David ever mention fear? Did he ever suggest Emily might harm him? Chris hesitated, torn between loyalty to David's memory and his conscience. He said she wouldn't let go, that she'd rather see him destroyed than let him leave. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Emily's chest constricted, but she forced her face into practiced composure. Inside, though, panic clawed at her ribs. Her attorney countered with arguments of despair and circumstance. They painted David as a man living a double life, crushed by secrets, driven to the edge. They leaned heavily on the pills, the whiskey, the pattern of late nights that hinted at spiraling depression. But the detectives weren't finished. They presented inconsistencies. The smudged receipt tucked into David's jacket, the wiped counters, the lack of fingerprints where there should have been many. The timeline frayed under scrutiny. Emily felt the walls closing in. Every glance from the jury carried judgment. Every whispered note between lawyers tightened the noose around her. She wanted to scream that it wasn't supposed to be this way, that David had destroyed her first, that betrayal had poisoned everything. But the courtroom wasn't a place for rage. It was a place for evidence, for stories, for illusions torn apart. And in the back row she saw Chris watching her, his expression unreadable. Guilt and sorrow warred in his eyes, but beneath them something else lingered, a question he hadn't answered yet. Would he let her fall, or would he shoulder part of the lie to keep David's memory intact? The gavel cracked, calling the room to order. Emily's breath caught. The trial wasn't over, but the truth was no longer hers to control. The story she had tried to script was unraveling thread by thread, and soon, the final verdict would be all that remained. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as the jury filed back into their seats. Emily sat rigid, her hands cold despite the warmth of the overhead lights. She could feel every eye on her, the attorneys, the spectators, the reporters scribbling notes that would soon turn her tragedy into headlines. The judge's voice rang steady, formal, unyielding. Has the jury reached a verdict? A foreman stood, holding a slip of paper that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Emily's pulse thundered as she watched him unfold it. Guilty. The word shattered through her like glass. Guilty of murder. Guilty of deception. Guilty of letting love twist into something monstrous. Her lawyer touched her arm gently, whispering something about appeals, but Emily barely heard. The sound of the gavel echoed like a final nail in her coffin. She turned her head slightly and caught Chris's eyes across the room. His face was stricken with grief, but his gaze carried no victory, only sorrow. He had testified, told his truth, and in doing so, sealed her fate. As she was led away in handcuffs, whispers followed her. Some pitied her, others condemned her, but none of them truly understood. None of them had lived in the hollow silence of her home, had watched the man she loved become a stranger in front of her, had borne the weight of betrayal so heavy it crushed her breath. The cell was small, bare, and cold. At night, Emily lay awake on the thin mattress, the clang of distant doors and muffled sobs drifting through the walls. She thought often of David, his laughter in the early years, the promises they made when the world felt bright. Those memories hurt the most, because they reminded her of what had been possible, of the life that had rotted slowly into lies. But she also thought of Chris. His kindness, his tears in the courtroom, his inability to hate her even as he revealed her crime. She wondered if he would ever forgive himself for the role he played. Perhaps he already carried enough guilt for two. Time moved strangely in confinement. Days blurred together, broken only by the rhythm of meals and the shuffling of footsteps in the corridors. Emily replayed her choices endlessly. The night of the storm, the soup laced with poison, the way she had watched David collapse without lifting a hand. Sometimes in her darkest hours, she asked herself if she regretted it. The answer was never simple. Regret didn't undo betrayal. Regret didn't resurrect trust. Regret didn't erase the years of silence, the manipulation, the cruelty of being cast aside like an accessory once her usefulness expired. What she regretted most was not the act itself, but the life that had made it feel inevitable. The cost of silence, she realized, was everything. Silence had been David's prison, forcing him to hide who he was. Silence had been hers, keeping her from speaking her pain, from admitting her suspicions, from reaching for help before it was too late. Silence had festered between them until it became poison, until it spilled into their lives and left only ruin. And now, silence was all she had left. One afternoon, she was allowed a single phone call. Her sister's voice trembled on the line, offering prayers, forgiveness, fragments of family that Emily could barely hold on to. When the call ended, she sat in the sterile room, staring at the receiver. For the first time, she let herself weep. Not for David, not for Chris, but for the woman she had once been. Outside, the world moved on. New scandals filled the headlines. New tragedies claimed the public's attention. Emily faded into a cautionary tale, another name in the endless cycle of betrayal and crime. But within the silence of her cell, she knew the truth. Love, when corrupted by lies, could be more deadly than hate. And the final verdict wasn't carved by the gavel, but by every choice, every secret, every moment of silence that had brought her here.